Bound at the wrists with frayed twine, the woman who had nursed Samuel Briggs through cholera was shoved forward into the center of the Silver Dollar Saloon. The piano music stopped dead. Around them, the air hung thick with cigar smoke, cheap perfume, and the desperate sweat of men trying to strike it rich in the Colorado dirt. Samuel didn't ask for gold or silver. Slamming a piece of paper on the felt table, he traded his wife for a single, unopened bottle of Kentucky bourbon and the forgiveness of a $50 gambling debt. She was sold. Just like that. Until a shadow detached itself from the corner of the room, and a man who hadn't spoken a word in 5 years decided the price was too low. Leadville, Colorado, in the winter of 1878, was not a place for the weak, and it certainly was no place for a woman entirely alone. The town was a jagged scar of canvas tents and rough-hewn pine buildings carved into the side of the Rocky Mountains, a place where men pulled silver from the earth and spent it just as fast on whiskey and sin. Clarice Briggs had arrived in Leadville 6 months prior, her heart full of naive hope, and her wagon loaded with the meager belongings she shared with her husband, Samuel. Samuel was a man of grand promises and hollow delivery. He had sworn to Clarice's dying father back in Ohio that he would provide for her, that the western frontier held a fortune just waiting for a man willing to swing a pickaxe. But Samuel's pickaxe spent more time rusting in the snow than biting into rock. He found his true calling at the card tables of the Silver Dollar Saloon, a notorious establishment run by a ruthless, iron-fisted proprietor named Jeremiah Haggerty. Haggerty was a man who owned half the town and had a lien on the other half. He was a mountain of a man with a tailored silk vest and a smile that never quite reached his cold, dead eyes. Over the months, Samuel had whittled away Clarice's dowry, their savings, and finally, their dignity. Clarice took in washing from the miners, her hands cracked and bleeding from the lye soap and the biting cold, just to keep a roof over their heads in a drafty shanty on the edge of town. The night it all came crashing down was the coldest of the year. The wind howled down Harrison Avenue, driving ice like glass shards against the windows. Clarice was huddled near the cast-iron stove, trying to coax warmth from a handful of damp kindling, when the door kicked open. Samuel stood in the frame, his eyes wild, his breath reeking of cheap rye. 2 of Haggerty's men, brutes named Cobb and Miller, flanked him. "Get your coat, Clarice," Samuel slurred, his eyes darting everywhere but her face. "We're going for a walk." Clarice's heart seized. "Samuel, it's a blizzard out there. What have you done?" She didn't get an answer. Cobb grabbed her by the arm, his grip bruising her flesh through her thin calico dress, and dragged her out into the merciless night. They marched her down the muddy, frozen street, straight through the swinging doors of the Silver Dollar. The saloon was packed, a roaring fire doing little to chase away the chill of the desperate souls inside. At the center of the room, sitting at the high-stakes table, was Jeremiah Haggerty. He was slowly turning a full, sealed bottle of premium Kentucky bourbon in his massive hands. "Well, well," Haggerty rumbled, his voice cutting through the din of the bar. "The prodigal gambler returns, and he brought the collateral." Clarice stood frozen, her wet boots sinking into the sawdust floor. She looked at Samuel, who was shivering, not from the cold, but from the agonizing need for a drink. "The debt is $50, Samuel," Haggerty said smoothly, and you ain't got a plug nickel. But as I told you, I'm a reasonable man. I have a need for a housemaid, someone to clean my private quarters upstairs, keep the fires burning, keep me company." His eyes raked over Clarice, making her stomach heave. "I'll wipe the slate clean, and, because I'm feeling generous on this freezing night, I'll throw in this bottle, pure Kentucky gold." Clarice gasped, the reality of the moment crashing over her. "Samuel, no, you cannot do this. I am your wife before God." Samuel finally looked at her, his eyes hollow, empty of the boy she had married. "I'm sorry, Clarice. It's just for a while. Just till I strike a vein. I gotta have a drink, Clarice. I'm dying from the inside." With a trembling hand, Samuel signed a hastily scribbled bill of sale that transferred Clarice's employment and guardianship to Haggerty. It was illegal, it was barbaric, but in Leadville, Haggerty was the law. The sheriff, a man named Davies, was drinking at the end of the bar, looking steadfastly at the bottom of his glass. Samuel grabbed the bottle of bourbon, his hands shaking violently. He didn't even look back as he stumbled out the back door into the alley. Clarice stood alone in the center of the room. The piano player, who had stopped, nervously began to plink a slow, mournful tune. Haggerty stood up, a triumphant smirk on his face. "Come along now, Clarice. Let's get you upstairs and out of those wet clothes." He reached for her. Clarice shrank back, tears of absolute despair freezing on her cheeks. She braced herself for the touch of his heavy, ringed hand. But that touch never came. A sound cut through the room. It wasn't a shout. It was the distinct, terrifying click of a Winchester rifle hammer being pulled back. The sound originated from the darkest corner of the saloon, a booth completely swallowed by shadows. Every eye in the room turned. Out of the darkness stepped a ghost. He was a giant of a man, clad in a heavy coat of cured grizzly bear hide. His hair was dark and unruly, falling over the collar of his coat, and a thick, rugged beard obscured the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that caught the light of the kerosene lamps, piercing, icy grey, like a frozen mountain lake. A jagged silver scar slashed down from his temple, narrowly missing his left eye, a brutal reminder of a violent past. No one knew his real name. The town called him the Ghost of the Sawatch. He was a mountain man, a trapper who came down from the high peaks only twice a year to trade pelts for salt, coffee, and ammunition. He never drank, he never gambled, and, according to local legend, he hadn't spoken a single word to another living soul in 5 years. Haggerty's men immediately went for their holsters, but the mountain man's Winchester was already leveled squarely at Haggerty's chest. The air in the saloon grew so tense it felt like it might shatter. Haggerty raised his hands slowly, his smirk fading into a scowl. "Now, hold on a minute, friend. There's no need for trouble. This here is a private, legal transaction. The girl's husband signed her over." The mountain man did not speak. His expression remained utterly unreadable. With slow, deliberate movements, keeping the rifle steady with one hand, he reached into the deep pocket of his bear hide coat. He pulled out a heavy canvas pouch. He tossed it underhand. The pouch hit the poker table with a heavy, muffled thud. The leather string loosened, and out spilled a glittering, undeniable fortune. Raw gold nuggets, some the size of acorns, alongside dust so pure it seemed to glow in the lamplight. It was easily worth $500, 10 times Samuel's debt. Haggerty stared at the gold, his greed momentarily overriding his pride. "What's this?" The mountain man gestured with the barrel of his rifle, first to the gold, then to the bill of sale sitting on the table, finally to Clarice. The meaning was clear. "I am buying the contract. You want the girl?" Haggerty sneered, his eyes darting between the gold and the rifle. He did some quick math in his head. The gold was worth far more than the girl, but Haggerty was a man who hated losing face in his own town. "That contract belongs to me. She's mine." The mountain man didn't flinch. He simply shifted his weight, and the barrel of the Winchester lowered a fraction of an inch, pointing directly at Haggerty's stomach. A gut shot. The slowest, most agonizing way to die in the West. Sweat beaded on Haggerty's forehead despite the cold draft in the room. He looked at his men, Cobb and Miller. They were hardened killers, but they were also pragmatists. The mountain man had the drop on their boss, and the sheer, intimidating stillness of the stranger made them hesitate. "Fine," Haggerty spat, grabbing the canvas pouch and sweeping the gold nuggets into his pockets. He shoved the crumpled bill of sale across the table. "Take her. But don't you ever show your face in my establishment again, mountain man." The man didn't acknowledge the threat. He walked slowly across the room, the crowd parting for him like water. He stopped in front of Clarice. Up close, he was even more imposing. He smelled of pine needles, wood smoke, and cold leather. Clarice was trembling so hard her teeth chattered. She had traded one monster for another. What did a savage mountain man want with a woman? The stories the townsfolk told about the trappers were horrific. Men driven mad by isolation, turning to violence and cruelty. He didn't grab her. He didn't speak. He simply picked up the bill of sale from the table, held it close to the flame of a nearby kerosene lamp, and watched it burn to ash. He dropped the ashes on the floor. Then he unbuttoned his massive bear hide coat, took it off, and draped it over Clarice's shivering shoulders. The coat was heavy, incredibly warm, and swallowed her whole. He nodded toward the door. Clarice had no choice. She walked out of the Silver Dollar Saloon, the silent mountain man, a heavy, protective shadow at her back. They walked out into the blizzard. The wind was a physical force, but the mountain man pushed through it effortlessly. He led her to a massive black draft horse tied to a post. He effortlessly lifted Clarice into the saddle as if she weighed no more than a child, then swung up behind her. He didn't crowd her, keeping a respectful distance in the saddle, but his arms on either side of her holding the reins provided a shield against the biting wind. As they rode out of Leadville, ascending into the treacherous, snow-choked passes of the Sawatch Range, Clarice looked back at the fading lights of the town. She was riding into the unknown with a man who had bought her life with a bag of gold. She squeezed her eyes shut, preparing herself for the nightmare that was surely to come. The journey took 4 grueling hours. The black horse plunged through snowdrifts that reached its chest, guided only by the mountain man's silent commands and intimate knowledge of the invisible trail. Clarice fell in and out of a frozen, exhausted sleep, kept upright only by the steady, unyielding presence behind her. Just as the first faint hints of dawn turned the driving snow a pale, bruised purple, they arrived. Nestled into the side of a steep, pine-covered ridge, completely hidden from the valley below, was a cabin. It was sturdy, built of massive, interlocking spruce logs with a stone chimney that puffed a welcoming stream of white smoke into the frigid air. The man dismounted and lifted Clarice down. Her legs gave out immediately, her boots frozen stiff. Before she could hit the snow, he caught her. He carried her to the heavy oak door, kicked it open, and stepped inside. The cabin was a stark contrast to the brutal world outside. It was impeccably clean and surprisingly warm. The stone hearth held the glowing embers of a banked fire. Animal traps hung neatly on the walls alongside dried herbs and bundles of root vegetables. There was a single bed piled high with thick, clean wool blankets, a sturdy wooden table, and 2 chairs. He set her down gently in a chair near the hearth. He immediately went to work, throwing split logs onto the embers and blowing them into a roaring blaze. He then went to a cast-iron pump at a small sink, filled a kettle, and hung it over the fire. Clarice watched him, her heart pounding, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This is it, she thought. This is where he claims what he bought. She forced herself to speak, her voice a hoarse, terrified whisper. What are you going to do to me? The man, who had been unlacing his snowy boots, stopped. He turned his head and looked at her. His grey eyes were entirely devoid of malice. There was no lust, no cruelty, only a profound, ancient weariness. He stood up, walked to a small wooden cupboard, and retrieved a tin mug. He dropped a handful of dried leaves into it, poured boiling water from the kettle, and set it on the table in front of her. Peppermint and chamomile. Then he pointed to the bed. He pointed to Clarice. Clarice swallowed hard. You want me to... He shook his head firmly. He pointed to the bed, then made a gesture of laying his head on his hands, indicating sleep. Then he pointed to himself and pointed toward the heavy wooden door that led to a lean-to attached to the side of the cabin, the barn where he had stabled the horse. Clarice's eyes widened in disbelief. You're going to sleep in the barn? In this cold? He offered a single, curt nod. He grabbed a heavy woolen blanket from a chest at the foot of the bed, threw it over his shoulder, and walked out the door, shutting it firmly behind him. Clarice sat by the fire, the mug of tea warming her frozen hands, utterly bewildered. He had paid a king's ransom for her, yet he had burned the bill of sale. He had given her his coat, his fire, and his bed, banishing himself to the freezing barn. Who was this man? Over the next 3 days, the blizzard raged on, burying the cabin in 4 feet of snow. And over those 3 days, Clarice learned the silent language of Obadiah Abernathy. She found his name carved into the bottom of a beautifully whittled wooden bowl. Obadiah. It suited him. He came inside only to cook, tend the fire, and check on her. He moved with a quiet grace that belied his massive size. He cooked hearty stews of venison and dried potatoes, always serving her first. When Clarice tried to help, to wash the dishes or sweep the floor, he would gently but firmly take the rag or the broom from her hands and point her back to the chair by the fire. She realized with a jolt that she wasn't his prisoner, nor his servant. She was his guest. On the 4th day, the storm finally broke, revealing a sky of blinding, crystalline blue. Obadiah was outside, chopping wood, the rhythmic thwack of the axe echoing off the mountain. Clarice was inside, feeling her strength return. She decided to unpack the small satchel she had managed to grab before Cobb had dragged her out of her shanty in Leadville. It contained only a few meager possessions: a brush, a spare dress, and a heavy, worn Bible that had belonged to her grandfather, a man who had prospected these very mountains 30 years prior. As Clarice smoothed the leather cover of the Bible, she felt a strange ridge along the inside of the back binding. She frowned, picking at the stitching. It was loose. She carefully pulled the leather back, revealing a folded piece of yellowed parchment hidden beneath the lining. She unfolded it. It was a map. Drawn in her grandfather's shaky hand, it detailed a specific ridgeline, a grouping of 3 distinct pine trees, and an exact coordinate marked with a heavy black X. At the bottom, written in faded ink, were the words, "The Motherlode. The gold here runs thick as a man's arm. I leave this to my blood." Clarice gasped. Her grandfather had always told wild stories about finding a massive vein of gold just before he fell ill and had to abandon the mountains. But her family had always dismissed them as the ramblings of a sick old man. Suddenly, a terrifying realization washed over her. Samuel. Samuel hadn't just been selling her for a bottle of whiskey to settle a $50 debt. Samuel knew she carried her grandfather's Bible everywhere. Samuel knew about the rumors of the claim. He hadn't sold her to Haggerty for the debt. He had traded her so Haggerty's men could search her belongings and find the map, while Samuel took the bourbon as a pathetic cover story to flee town before Haggerty realized what he truly had. But Obadiah had intervened. Obadiah had taken her and the satchel away. Clarice rushed to the window. Down in the valley far below, the snow was pristine and untouched. But as she squinted, she saw a dark, moving line cutting through the white expanse, heading steadily up the mountain trail toward the ridge. It was a posse, 6 men on horseback. Jeremiah Haggerty had figured it out. He wasn't coming for the $50, and he wasn't coming for Clarice. He was coming for the Motherlode, and he was bringing an army to kill the silent mountain man who stood in his way. Clarice threw open the cabin door and ran out into the blinding snow. Obadiah looked up from his chopping block, his axe resting on a stump. "Obadiah," she screamed, holding up the map. "They're coming. Haggerty is coming, and he knows what I have." Obadiah dropped the axe. He didn't panic. He simply looked down at the valley, his icy grey eyes locking onto the distant, approaching riders. The ghost of the Sawatch walked slowly back into the cabin, pulled his Winchester from the wall, and began to fill his pockets with heavy brass cartridges. The silence of the mountain was about to be broken. The silence inside the cabin was no longer a peaceful retreat. It was a pressurized vessel waiting to shatter. Obadiah moved with a terrifying, calculated efficiency. He didn't frantically barricade the door. Instead, he pulled heavy oak shutters across the windows, leaving only narrow slits designed specifically for the barrel of a rifle. From a hidden floorboard beneath the bed, he hauled up a heavy canvas sack, clinking with ammunition and a second firearm, a well-oiled Colt single-action army revolver. He walked over to Clarice. Her breathing was shallow, her hands clutching the yellowed map that had suddenly turned from a family heirloom into a death warrant. Obadiah gently took her wrists, uncurling her fingers from the parchment. He folded it and slipped it into the breast pocket of her dress. Then he pressed the heavy Colt revolver into her trembling palms. He met her eyes, holding her gaze until the panic in her chest began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard necessity. He pointed to the cylinder, miming the action of pulling back the hammer and pulling the trigger. He pointed to a small gap in the chinking of the logs near the back door. The message was clear. Watch our backs. Shoot anyone who isn't me. Clarice swallowed the lump of terror in her throat and gave a single, resolute nod. She was done being traded. She was done being a victim of Leadville's greed. Outside, the crunch of a heavy hooves biting into the frozen crust of the snow echoed up the canyon. The posse had reached the tree line, about 50 yards down the slope from the cabin's clearing. Through the narrow slit in the heavy oak shutters, Clarice could see them. There were 6 men. Jeremiah Haggerty sat atop a massive roan gelding, a heavy buffalo hide coat making him look even larger than he was. Flanking him were Cobb and Miller, their rifles already drawn and resting across their saddles. But it was the man shivering on a scrawny mule in the center of the group that made Clarice's blood run cold. It was Samuel. His face was bruised, his lips split, and he looked entirely broken. He hadn't just traded her. He had failed to escape Haggerty's wrath when the saloon owner realized the map was missing. Haggerty had beaten the truth out of him and dragged him up the mountain as a guide. Abernathy, Haggerty's voice boomed, echoing off the sheer rock face of the Sawatch Ridge. The arrogant drawl was laced with a venomous fury. I know you're in there, and I know what the girl has. Send her out with the paper, and I'll let you live to trap another winter. Silence was Obadiah's only reply. He stood completely still, the barrel of his Winchester resting steadily in the window slit, his finger lightly grazing the trigger. Don't be a fool, mountain man, Haggerty roared, his breath pluming like dragon's smoke in the sub-zero air. You're outgunned and surrounded. The law don't apply up here. Send out the map. Samuel suddenly spurred his mule forward a half step, his voice cracking with desperate panic. Clarice, please, just give them the map. He's going to kill me, Clarice. Please, for the love of God. Clarice's heart twisted, not with love, but with a profound, bitter pity. The man she had married, the man she had crossed the country for, was begging her to hand over her legacy and her life to save his own pathetic hide. Obadiah didn't flinch. He didn't look at Clarice for permission. He simply adjusted his aim. Crack. The shot shattered the mountain stillness with deafening force. Obadiah hadn't aimed for Haggerty. The bullet kicked up a plume of ice and dirt mere inches from the hooves of Haggerty's roan. The massive horse reared up, screaming in panic, nearly throwing the saloon owner into the snowdrift. The posse erupted into chaos. The men scrambled from their saddles, diving for the cover of the thick pine trees. Light 'em up, Haggerty screamed, scrambling behind a massive boulder. Kill the trapper, but I want the girl alive. A hail of lead tore into the cabin. The heavy spruce logs splintered and groaned, absorbing the barrage. Inside, the noise was deafening, a terrifying drumbeat of death. Dust and wood chips rained down from the ceiling. Clarice covered her head, squeezing her eyes shut, but she forced herself to crawl toward the back door, gripping the heavy Colt. Obadiah was a phantom of violence. He moved smoothly from one firing slit to another, never staying in one place long enough for the posse to pinpoint his position. Every time his Winchester barked, a man outside cried out or scrambled for deeper cover. He wasn't just shooting, he was suppressing them, controlling the battlefield with terrifying precision. But there were too many of them. Miller, flank left. Haggerty's voice drifted up through a lull in the firing. Get around the back. Clarice heard the crunch of snow behind the cabin. Her breath hitched. She raised the heavy revolver, resting the barrel on the edge of the chinking gap, just as Obadiah had instructed. Through the narrow slit, she saw a shadow moving stealthily through the dense, snow-laden pines. It was Miller, his rifle raised, trying to sneak around to the lean-to. She cocked the hammer back. It sounded incredibly loud in her own ears. Before she could pull the trigger, a horrific, metallic clang echoed through the trees, followed instantly by a blood-curdling scream. Miller dropped his rifle and fell backward into the snow, thrashing violently. Hidden beneath the fresh layer of powder was one of Obadiah's massive, steel-jawed bear traps. It had snapped shut around Miller's shin with bone-crushing force. Obadiah shot Clarice a brief, grim look of acknowledgement. The mountain itself was his ally. He had rigged the perimeter the moment the snow had started falling days ago. "He's got traps out," Cobb yelled from the front, his voice edged with panic. "The whole ridge is rigged." "Then shoot the damn cabin to pieces," Haggerty roared back. "Burn it down if you have to." The firing intensified. A bullet slipped through the window slit, grazing Obadiah's shoulder. He grunted, a short, sharp sound of pain, as a dark stain began to blossom on the sleeve of his flannel shirt. He didn't stop firing, but his movements slowed. Clarice watched him, a fierce surge of protective anger washing over her. This man, a stranger who had bought her freedom, was bleeding for her. He was dying for her. "Obadiah," she breathed, crawling over to him. She tore a strip of fabric from her petticoat and pressed it hard against the graze on his shoulder. He looked down at her, his icy grey eyes softening for a fraction of a second. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the tree line. Not Haggerty, but Samuel. "I'm leaving. You're all crazy. I ain't dying for this." Through the slit, Clarice saw Samuel scrambling frantically back toward his mule, abandoning his cover. He was leaving her to die, just as he had sold her. "You ain't going nowhere, you coward," Haggerty bellowed. A single shot rang out from Haggerty's position behind the boulder. Samuel froze, his hands reaching for his chest. He stood there for a long, terrible moment, staring down at the crimson blooming on his coat, before collapsing face first into the snow. Clarice gasped, pressing her hand over her mouth. She felt no sorrow, only a profound, hollow shock. The last tie to her old life was severed, bleeding out in the freezing snow. "Now it's just you and me, Abernathy," Haggerty sneered, stepping out from behind the boulder, using a thick, fallen log as a shield as he began to advance up the slope. Cobb was dead. Miller was bleeding out in a trap. The remaining hired guns had fled when Haggerty shot Samuel. It was only the saloon owner left, driven mad by the promise of the mother lode. Haggerty raised his rifle, aiming directly at the heavy wooden door of the cabin. "I'm coming in, mountain man, and I'm taking what's mine." Obadiah leaned heavily against the log wall. He was losing blood, his breaths coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He looked at his Winchester. He had 2 rounds left. He looked at the heavy oak door. It wouldn't hold up to a point-blank blast from Haggerty's rifle. He closed his eyes for a moment, the deep, jagged scar on his face pulling tight. Clarice watched him, terrified that he was finally giving up. But when he opened his eyes, they were clear, cold, and utterly terrifying. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking up. Above the cabin, towering like a frozen tidal wave, was the sheer face of the Sawatch Ridge. The 3-day blizzard had piled a massive, unstable cornice of snow right at the peak, directly overhanging the slope where Haggerty was currently advancing. Obadiah pushed himself away from the wall. He didn't aim at Haggerty. He pushed the barrel of his rifle through the upper edge of the window slit, pointing it skyward at a 70-degree angle. Clarice realized what he was doing. Her eyes widened. Obadiah, no, it will crush us too. He looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't just point or nod. He reached out with his good arm, pulled her close against his chest, and shielded her body beneath the heavy timber frame of the stone hearth. He braced the rifle with one arm. He didn't hesitate. Crack. The gunshot echoed upward, a sharp, violent crack against the frozen stone of the mountain. For 2 seconds, absolutely nothing happened. The silence returned, heavy and mocking. Haggerty laughed, a cruel barking sound. Missed, you're losing your touch, Abernathy. He stepped over Samuel's body, bringing his rifle to his shoulder. Then came the sound. It didn't start as a roar. It started as a deep, resonant groan, a vibration that Clarice could feel in her very teeth. It was the sound of 1,000,000 tons of packed ice and snow detaching from the bedrock. Haggerty looked up, his cruel laughter dying instantly in his throat. The groan turned into a deafening, catastrophic roar. The entire top of the mountain seemed to collapse. A massive wall of white death plummeted down the ridge. The sheer velocity of the snow displaced the air, creating a shockwave that hit the cabin before the avalanche even arrived. The heavy oak shutters blew inward, shattering into kindling. The cabin shuddered violently, the massive spruce logs groaning in agony as the perimeter of the avalanche clipped the structure. Obadiah held Clarice tight, burying her face in his chest as the world descended into absolute roaring darkness. Outside, there was no time to scream. The avalanche hit the tree line like a freight train, snapping massive pines like matchsticks. Jeremiah Haggerty, his greed, his cruelty, and his stolen gold were swallowed instantly by the relentless, churning white maw of the mountain. Inside the cabin, dust and snow filled the air. Clarice clung to Obadiah, the roar of the avalanche drowning out even her own thoughts. It felt like the mountain was tearing itself apart, tearing them apart with it. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the roaring stopped. It was replaced by a silence so absolute, so profound, it made Clarice's ears ring. The cabin was completely dark, buried under several feet of snow, but the heavy timber frame and the stone hearth had held. They were alive. Obadiah didn't move for a long time. He just held her, his heart beating a steady, powerful rhythm against her cheek. Finally, he shifted. He pushed the debris off them, standing up in the gloom. He walked to the door, which was blocked by a wall of packed snow. He didn't grab a shovel. He simply placed his heavy, calloused hands against the snowpack and began to dig like a wild animal. Within minutes, pale sunlight pierced the darkness of the cabin. He widened the hole, pushing through to the outside world. Clarice followed him out. The landscape was unrecognizable. The dense pine forest below them was gone, replaced by a smooth, terrifyingly pristine chute of white that stretched all the way to the valley floor. Haggerty, Samuel, the horses, everything was gone, buried under 30 feet of concrete, hard snow. Clarice fell to her knees in the snow, trembling violently as the adrenaline finally crashed. It was over. She was free. Haggerty was dead. Samuel was gone. The debt was erased by the mountain itself. She looked up at Obadiah. He was standing near the edge of the avalanche path, looking at the rock face that had been exposed when the snow tore away. Clarice walked over to him, pulling her grandfather's map from her pocket. She looked at the coordinates, then looked at the ridge above them. The 3 distinct pines that had been markers were gone, swept away. But the shape of the rock face, she gasped. Obadiah wasn't just living on a mountain. He had built his cabin directly on top of the X, where the avalanche had ripped away the soil and loose rock on the cliff face just 10 yards from the cabin. A massive vein of quartz was exposed, and running through the center of that quartz, glittering brilliantly in the freezing afternoon sun, was a seam of raw gold as thick as a man's arm. The mother lode. Her grandfather hadn't been crazy. It had been right here, hidden beneath the earth, waiting to be unearthed by the violence of men. Clarice stared at the gold, then looked at Obadiah. He was bleeding, exhausted, and covered in snow. He had risked everything for a woman he didn't know, fighting a war he didn't start. "It's here," Clarice whispered, tears finally spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. It was here the whole time. Obadiah looked at the gold. His expression didn't change. There was no greed in his icy grey eyes, no lust for wealth. He looked back at Clarice. He reached out, his large, rough hand gently wiping a tear from her cheek. He opened his mouth. His throat worked, swallowing hard. The muscles in his neck strained as he fought against 5 years of self-imposed silence. A silence born from a grief too heavy to bear. When his voice finally came, it was rough, deep, and gravelly, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a riverbed. "Keep it." Clarice stared at him, stunned. "What?" "The gold," Obadiah rumbled, his voice gaining a fraction of strength. "It's yours. It was always yours." "But you bought me," Clarice said, her voice trembling. "You paid, Haggerty." Obadiah shook his head slowly. He looked out over the pristine, silent valley. "I didn't buy you, Clarice," he said, speaking her name for the very first time. It sounded like a prayer on his lips. "I paid a ransom. You belong to no one." He turned and looked back at the battered, bruised cabin that had weathered the storm. Then he looked at her, extending his hand. "Come inside," Obadiah said softly, the harshness of the mountain finally melting away from his scarred face. "Let's get warm." Clarice looked at the immense fortune glittering in the rock face, a wealth that men had just died for. Then she looked at the calloused, bloody hand offered to her by the silent mountain man who had given her back her life. She left the gold in the rock. She reached out, placed her hand in his, and let him lead her home. Clarice and Obadiah's harrowing fight for survival against the ruthless Jeremiah Haggerty proves that the true value of the West wasn't found in the gold buried in the dirt, but in the courage of those willing to risk everything for freedom. The motherlode was unearthed by blood and snow, but the greatest treasure was the silence broken by a man who chose love over isolation. What did you think of Obadiah's brutal, calculated defense of the cabin? Did Haggerty get exactly what he deserved from the mountain? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this gritty, romantic tale of survival and redemption in the Wild West, hit that like button, share this story with your fellow history buffs, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling stories of frontier justice.
Hi, my name is William Sunny, the owner and manager of Iron Cowboy Gardena. After watching the video, Father sent his soul for a bottle of whiskey until a silent mountain man paid the price to set her free. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What struck me most about this story was the contrast between greed and genuine compassion. Clarice was treated like a possession by people who only cared about what they could gain, yet one quiet act of courage changed everything. Watching the bond of trust grow between two people facing impossible circumstances made this story feel both powerful and deeply human. One gentle lesson I took from it is that a person's worth can never be measured by what others are willing to pay or trade. Sometimes the people who make the biggest difference in our lives are the ones who step forward when no one else is his will. What moment stood out to you the most? And do you think Obadiah's silence made his actions even more meaningful? Maybe the story reminds us to look beyond appearances and judge people by their character rather than their reputation. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these Mountain Man stories, feel free to like the video or subscribe to Iron Cowboy Gardena for more journeys of resilience, hope, and unexpected kindness.